could actually run tests against other servers in the grid. And that's really more for getting used to the interface and understanding how to run tests. So as soon as you have your own server, then you switch over and start testing your own. All right, I think we're at 11:30. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to those who were here yesterday for my intro. Welcome back for the advanced, or part 2 as it were. We're going to, again, just brief introduction, who I am. Richard Ettema, lead consultant with Aegis.net based in the United States, FHIR certified implementer. That's the beta certification program they did for the current proficiency exam. Been doing this for quite a while, FHIR for over 4 years, committer to the spec, and author of our Aegis Wildfire test server, as well as the senior architect for Touchstone as our testing environment as well. Just a recap from yesterday. We talked yesterday about the fact that now that the FHIR spec has a testing framework defined in it, we now have a means to define how you test your implementations in FHIR. So the URL is basically testing.html up on the spec, and that's where you're going to see all the information about what a FHIR test engine should be capable of doing for testing of FHIR implementation according to the specification. The framework defines that process and also a new resource called TestScript. And the TestScript is our computable, executable definition of running a test or a series of tests. And so we're going to kind of see a little bit more of that as we go along. But first I want to talk about some information about reliable and repeatable testing. Because when you start to do testing, you want to make sure that you have a test definition that you can run over and over again. You know, if you want to do regression testing and so forth. But you want to make sure that that test is reliable and you can repeat it over and over again and have confidence in it. So a workflow example is you run a test, something goes wrong, a little bug is detected, developer goes back and corrects it, you run it again, and it passes. Yay. How can we trust that the correction is still being tested the same way? So that's what we're trying to get to here. The test script gives us that definition that's consistent, but above and beyond that, we also need data, good test data that we know is reliable and repeatable that we can use over and over again in our test scenarios. And so we're going to take a look at a reliable and repeatable testing during the hands-on exercises. So if you come over to the FHIR testing table this afternoon, I've got an exercise or a series of exercises that go through test scripts that kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about here. Where if we start out with just static data, and imagine if I run a test using static data against my server, but somebody else runs the same test with the same static data against my server, there is a potential problem there. I could be using the same data and I don't have a consistent results that are going to happen. And that's all part of the hands-on exercises. And I can explain more of that this afternoon. So when we're talking about testing, we want to develop our test cases. We want to identify the criteria, or also known as asserts, in the test script. The asserts are where the rules are defined for what we're trying to test in our scenario. So what do the asserts allow us to do? Well, we can test simple values. You know, is this the patient I expected? Is just, John Doe of patient identifier XYZ? Is this the operational response that I expect, a 200 or a 201, or even if I'm expecting a 400 or something like that, I can test for that. Did I get multiple matches when I only expected one match? It's just some simple comparisons. We can look for conformance requirements as well, too. The validation engine from the FHIR specification, I've incorporated that into Touchstone. So there's an assert where you run validation using profile, so specific profile against a resource type, and then that validation engine will report back how it did. If the validation engine reports back any fatal or error messages, the assert fails. If it reports back a warning, the assert reports a warning. If it comes back with just information or nothing, then it passed. So very simple in that term, but that's just one assert where we can link out to the validation engine. And then also conditionality or constraints. The FHIR specification contains a lot of optionality. And you'll see that when you start looking at just simple operations like create or update. Because one of the things as an example is that FHIR defines something called versioning. So how many people are familiar with the metadata in a resource? Okay, so you have a resource ID, then you have this meta section, and that's where you see like the last updated date and time, and you also see the last user, but there's also a version ID that you can specify in there as well too. Well, your FHIR server does not have to support FHIR versioning to be a valid FHIR server. So now how do I write a test where you could give me versioning back or not? Because I don't want to have two different versions of the test. I want to have one version of the test that will work against all different types of servers that may or may not support that. So we have some techniques within the test script. There's a rules construct where we can do some conditional types of things. So that's always fun to play around with. So asserts can perform simple operations here. So the operators that you get are basically checking for equality, containment, in, not in, and so forth. Specification allows for use of XPath, JSONPath expressions. Complex evaluations, as I mentioned, we can do rules. So there's a whole rules engine that you can develop for your FHIR test engine, which we've done, where you can write external rules in like Groovy script or XSLT, that type of thing. And we also allow for FHIRPath expressions. So this was actually added for STU3 for the test script. So now there's an expression element on the assert where you can list out a FHIRPath, like the invariants that you'll find on the profiles, that do different constraints. Now, FHIRPath is supported, but I will caveat this with I'm not going to teach you FHIRPath here. Okay, so if you want to learn more about FHIRPath, there's the whole specification is available to you as well. But I will give you some examples of using FHIRPath as we go on. Complex asserts, as I said, we're doing some conditionality checks, some constraints, or the reason we might want to do this is to simplify an existing test construct. So if I have multiple asserts trying to do things, I might want to try to collapse that using a rule so that I have one assert where I can combine things and so forth. FHIRPath, the nice thing about FHIRPath is that by itself, you know how you want to use a path expression like XPath or JSONPath, you're usually going to path in to find a value, right? Because that's what the pathing language is good for. But FHIRPath also allows you to do expressions within the FHIRPath itself. So you can do conditional checks all in the expression itself. So the FHIRPath gives you a lot more functionality, a lot more things that you can do in a simple, single assert, if you will. Again, rules and rule sets. We support Groovy, Schematron, and XSLT, although generally I write all my rules using Groovy because it's a little more agnostic. Schematron and XSLT, you're kind of limited to XML. So here's an example of doing FHIRPath. So first we have to define what it is we want to test. So we have an assert that we want to define, and that assert is confirm the search set bundle total number of entries is at least 1. Okay, I'm doing a search operation, and I want to verify that I get at least one match back in my search. Okay, that's a very simple thing I want to check. I don't want 0 results, I want to find at least 1. Okay? Well, let's take a look at an XPath and JSONPath way of doing this, and then compare it to how we might write it in FHIRPath. So in the test script itself, the assert definition is given as such. I'm using XML as my representation here. So there's an assert with an operation of greater than. I'm going to XPath into bundle total, and I'm going to make sure that it's greater than 0. Pretty simple. If I do it as JSONPath, well, I'm just doing a dot total. So that's just the JSONPath way of doing things. Well, how would I do that with FHIRPath? Well, I can do it with one expression. So instead of having to write the operator and the value and the path as 3 separate things, I can use one expression with FHIRPath to go to the bundle total, and again, because of FHIRPath, you have to actually convert it to the correct data type that you're going to compare it against. So there's a little toInteger method there. And then I use greater than 0. So it's all combined into one expression. You can get a lot more complex with FHIRPath, but this gives you a flavor of what I'm talking about. There is actually another way of doing this, which FHIRPath gives you that you couldn't do normally, and that's simply, I want to actually count the number of entries that came back in my bundle. So the bundle entry is a collection, right? And that actually is a much better representation for that single bundle resource, so I can count them and make sure I have greater than 0. So I've got some things that I can do variation-wise with FHIRPath that I don't necessarily have available with XPath and JSONPath. So, does that make sense? Yes?
I always perceive FHIRPath greatest advantage is that it doesn't tell you whether or not the serialization format is XML or JSON.
Correct.
But other than that, I thought XPath also married into XQuery, which has the count thing. So you could write that same expression in XPath if you wish. If you wish.
Yeah. But you're limited to XML.
True.
Right.
So that's probably the biggest advantage that FHIRPath has.
Correct. And that is, you know, so, and also turtle, if you want to use the RDF syntax. So the FHIRPath is syntax agnostic.
Right.
Right. And that is the major benefit. But of course, it does give you all of the query specification methods and so forth. It's a little bit simpler, I think, to understand than trying to learn XPath versus JSONPath, because a lot of times I'll write a test script where I'm testing the JSONPath or the JSON format. Well, then I have to write all my path expressions as JSONPath to make sure that I'm going to go, you know, so then if I have XML, I have to rewrite my test script using XPath, whereas I could have one test script, regardless of format, and have FHIRPath as my expression.
The one that rules them all.
Yes, yes.
Is there any reason why you don't convert internally the JSON to XML? So that's
Before FHIRPath came along, guess what we did?
Right.
Yeah, we did exactly that. So even today, Touchstone will support you running an XPath expression against a JSON format.
Yeah.
So, and vice versa. So we will do that internally for you, but I still like FHIRPath. You know, it's a little bit simpler in terms of expression. So rules and rule sets, again, this is a different way to do complex asserts. Rules are called during the test script execution when the assert is being evaluated. And the rule will call out to an external scripted little snippet of code, if you will. And again, Groovy is generally what I end up doing here. And again, the nice thing about Groovy is that I can reference it either JSON or XML. You know, so it's a little more agnostic that way. In our implementation, what we've done is we've taken the operation context and we've provided that to the rule that the assert is going to call. And so we've got a little way of noting all of the elements of the operation context, and they're referenceable within the Groovy script code that you write. So it's kind of an assumed, okay, I know that my context is going to contain all the headers from the request and the response, and I have access to all the payload and all that type of thing. So that allows me access. Another benefit of this that's really cool is that we grab your capability statement from your server, and that capability statement is part of the context of the test execution. Therefore, it's part of something that I can reference in the rule, and so now I can do comparisons directly in my Groovy script between your capability statement and what I'm trying to assert in there. So I can see, do you support versioning for this resource type? And if you do, then do this. If you don't, skip it, type of thing. Okay? So that's some of the fun things about rules and rule sets. And a rule set is really nothing more than a collection of rules. So in one single assert, I can implement multiple rules through a rule set. Yes?
Maybe a question a little bit outside of scope, but do you find that capability statements are generally accurate as to what the server actually can do?
When we are running a test, we trust right? That you have created your capability statement with the correct information that tells us what your system is capable of doing. Now, we trust it in terms of like conditional asserts that I'm talking about. We're not going to stop you from running a test script if your capability statement doesn't contain the capabilities that we're testing. We'll warn you about it, but we'll still let you run it. Okay, we're not going to try to stop you from doing something. You know, you can step over yourself if you want to. That's not a problem. But you know, we're going to report whatever happens based on the test, and then we can correlate that to your capability statement.
Right.
And we can see that when we look at the conformance analytics screens within Touchstone. We can do that comparison. Another nice aspect of the FHIR test engine, what's supposed to be capable, and what we do in Touchstone, is that you can do external FHIR Client or peer-to-peer testing. So Touchstone normally, if you think about it, is acting as a client for you on your behalf. So you have a server as the system under test, and then Touchstone is going to execute the operation defined however you define it. Okay, so don't think that Touchstone is a FHIR compliant client. Okay? Touchstone will act as a client and execute whatever you define in the test script. So if I define a create operation with some weird headers in it, Touchstone will just send them along. That's okay. Because I may want to be trying to test negative conditions. So I want to send you a bad request as part of the test. So again, we're not a FHIR compliant client. We're going to just follow what you tell us to actually execute. So if you imagine, we can actually define multi-actor type of scenarios within a single test script. So Touchstone can act as one of the actors. You could have external FHIR clients, and you can have FHIR servers. And so there's a mechanism in the test script for defining origins and destinations. You know, so the origin of this request is coming from FHIR Client 1 or 2, and the destination is going to be FHIR Server 3 or 4, whatever that might be. So to kind of illustrate how you would do this, how many people have seen Touchstone, have been in it? A couple? Three? Okay, so a few of you. So I'm going to show you some screens from the test setup and running it in a test execution. So when you do a test setup where the test script that you're going to execute needs to know the external FHIR client and an external server, that type of thing, it's going to prompt you. So normally you're going to fill in the destination, but now I've defined that I need an external FHIR client. So I just get a new drop down here. And this is going to go out and allow you access to any FHIR client system that you've registered in Touchstone for your organization, plus anybody else's FHIR client that might be publicly defined. So we give you access to all the publicly accessible systems, whether they're clients or servers. Additionally, you might find that you need to put in some variable information. So the test script defines variables to be used in the test, and more often than not, that's static data that we're just going to pull out of payloads and resources, but sometimes we're going to prompt you to fill things in. So if I want to do a generic type of a search, just on some parameters here, but I want you to give me the values, right? So this allows you to fill in the data that's going to be used in the test for that search. Okay. So just an example of dynamic variables as well. When you execute, normally when you execute and Touchstone acts as the client, it's off to the races. It's on its way, right? But now I have an external client that needs to send the request. Touchstone is no longer going to act. It's going to wait. So Touchstone, as the in-between person or actor here, is a proxy. You know, so we've assigned a proxy URL to the base URLs to all the servers. And so your client needs to know what that proxy URL is. And so what Touchstone is going to do is sit here in a waiting for request status. And here we're at the test executions. This is the high-level view, kind of a roll-up of what the test script is. What's more interesting is you can drill down into the test script that's waiting. And when you do that, you can expand and take a look. We're doing a patient search, and we're waiting for the request to come from this origin, right? So it's no longer Touchstone. We know what the origin is supposed to be, and this is our destination. Well, we give you a little help here. This is what we're expecting to intercept as the request. It's going to be a get to this URL. Notice it's the Touchstone AegisNet with a port number on it, so that's the assigned proxy URL to that server. The rest of it is going to be whatever the extension off the base URL might be, and so forth. But then we're looking for a patient search with an identifier, a given name, and a family name. And these are just the values that were entered during the test setup. A couple other things we're going to look for. Well, we have an accept header. I don't have a content type because it's a get operation. But there's another header here called user key, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Think about for a moment, how does Touchstone know which FHIR client is actually sending the request? I'm waiting for a request, but I got to know who's sending it. Because what if another client were to send a similar request to that server through that proxy URL while I'm waiting for this one to do it? I have to ignore all other clients except the one that I'm waiting for. So that's where it's important that your systems be publicly accessible. You have a public IP address because we're a cloud-based environment. So your client has to have a public IP that we can key off of to know that that's you. Well, sometimes there's a problem with that because you might be behind a firewall, right? You might have your client on your laptop. Well, I don't know the Wi-Fi network IP that's going to be assigned to you, neither do you probably. But we can use things like user key, which is an assigned string unique to you as a user, as part of the request. And that's a little clue to Touchstone to say, oh, this is the one that's sending the request. I can make that connection. When you actually do run that, when the client sends the request and we capture it, if for some reason the test does not flip the status, it's still waiting, but you know that you sent the request, Touchstone is actually going to capture it regardless of whether you have it assigned to a test or not. So we have a messages exchange screen that you can go to. So any message that Touchstone captures, that it sends or it captures, is going to get recorded, whether or not it correlates to a test execution or not. And so you can take a look down here. We have a bunch of filters, so who's the origin system and what's the status and all kinds of things here. So you can actually see this. If it's assigned to a test, you'll see the status of that test. Okay? And then you'll see the test execution link here and what was being done, who ran it, and how did it match. So notice here, it matched by the IP in this instance. But if it couldn't do the match by the IP, it might say user key or org key. So user key and org key are special placeholder values, as we call them in Touchstone. For your account, you can go to My Placeholders. So in the upper right corner, you'll have your name, right, for your user account. And under it, you'll see My Placeholders. Well, My Placeholders is where you edit or see what those values are that have been assigned to you. Your user key is just a nice random string here, about 20 characters long. If you want to regenerate it, go right ahead. But we ensure that that's going to be unique for every user in Touchstone. Okay? So when you regenerate it, we'll make sure we don't randomly duplicate somebody else's. Org key is at the organizational level, so you belong to Nictus. Okay? So Nictus has 3 user accounts in it, I know this now, and each of the users will have their individual user keys, but Nictus as an organization will always have that. So you've got a couple different ways of ensuring that the test system is recognized either by IP or these special key values. And it tells you can actually send them as a request header, or you can embed them like this as a specialized variable inside the payload. So you can put it in your narrative text of your resource, and we'll scan and find it for you.
So can a user run 2 tests in parallel? Because then they will have the same user key.
They can. Well, again, remember Touchstone is going to wait. Okay, so it's actually multi-threaded. So if you run 2 test scripts, 2 test executions at the same time that expect external FHIR clients, okay, it'll wait. Those threads will wait.
Yeah, but how does it know which test case the request is?
Well, remember, it's not simply, well, there could be a conflict, right? If they're both the search operations, which one does it assign it to?
Right.
Okay, so there will be an issue there. But if they're different operations, if one's doing a create and one's doing a search, then it's easy to pick out which one is going on. But yeah, so you have to be careful. Normally, if you're going to do a test execution with an external client, you're going to probably do it one at a time. You know, it just doesn't make sense to try to multi-thread and do multiple external FHIR client testing. And as I said, Touchstone is multi-threaded, so we can actually do concurrent test executions, you know, and handle those quite easily.
Richard,
Yes?
wouldn't they be different proxies then?
Well, it depends what the server is, what the proxy is assigned to.
Yeah.
So that's another good point. If you've got two tests that you're running, but they go to different servers, then it's pretty easy. Because we know that the request response is between these two as opposed to these two. So that would be another distinction, yes. Okay, one of the other cool things about Touchstone is we've introduced what we call the Touchstone API, where you can actually remotely monitor test execution. You can launch test executions and monitor them without having to go through the UI, through the user interface. And so the main purpose for this is, the main reason why I wanted this is because I have a Jenkins CI server that I use to build Wildfire. And so I can integrate through the API into Jenkins through the Groovy plugin. And I actually have an example of doing this with all of my code in the Touchstone user guide. So you can go take a look at this. So if you're running a continuous integration server and you want to incorporate Touchstone testing with your build process, so I build Wildfire, I generate the WAR file, my Jenkins build deploys it to a running Wildfly server, Wildfire on Wildfly, and then it kicks off my Touchstone test setups that I've indicated that I want to run against that app server that's now running my new build of Wildfire. And it'll just keep polling every minute to see what the status is, you know, the percentage complete of my test execution. When it goes to 100%, then I look at the overall status, which either is going to be pass or fail. And if it passes, my build passes. If it fails, I fail my build. So, and again, I've got that all documented in the user guide, if you want to take a look at that. But the capabilities of the API, as I mentioned, is you're launching on behalf of a remote test user, right? So you still have to authenticate. So the API contains a little, you know, simple authentication call first, and we're going to send you back an API key, which is a session that will be available for 5 minutes. And as long as you keep calling using that API key, it'll keep renewing the session. You know, so, but if you don't use it for 5 minutes, it'll time out. Right? Just a security thing. Any member of your organization can log into the Touchstone UI and see the running execution. So regardless of whether you run the test through the UI or remotely, the UI will show you the running test. So if somebody launches something remotely, then somebody else somewhere can go to the UI and see it running. These, you know, as I said, we have a authenticate here, so these are just the methods in the API that you're going to use to implement that. So we've got authenticate, test execution to launch, and also to, there's a post and a get there. So the get is getting the status after you launch it. And then you can get execution detail, script execution detail, so a lot of it matches up what you see on the UI, as if you were drilling down into the results. And then for STU3, a new resource type called test report was created. And so we've actually provided, through the API, a means to get the test report FHIR resource representation of the results, which is equivalent to what we call the script execution detail. So you can get it either in our format, which actually has a little bit more information right now, or you can get it in the FHIR test report format. And again, as I mentioned, I did a Jenkins CI integration thing internally for my benefit, but I've also written that up in our user guide. Okay, so you can go take a look at that. I can't do a demo of that right now because I don't have that publicly accessible. My Jenkins server is internal, so. But, now, conformance testing, with Touchstone and with the FHIR test engine, the whole idea here is you want to do conformance testing. So you want to test against, obviously, the FHIR specification and a particular version of that specification. Continuous conformance testing is what the goal is here. We want, as we go forward here, organizations to keep continuously testing as they keep developing new features and so forth. We want to go back and retest to make sure you didn't break anything that was working before. And if you have new features, we'd like to create new tests to test the new features as well. And as I mentioned before, we do have a conformance analytics interface here. So in this particular instance, what I'm showing you is my wildfire server for STU3, which is 3.0.1, and then against the same specification, FHIR 3.0.1. And here, this dashboard is showing you these sunbursts, which are the suites of test scripts. So the outer edge of each of these sunbursts is each individual test script. And then they're grouped by a folder structure, so we just replicate that here in the sunburst. So you can see I've got some advanced tests where I'm really, hitting the API. Over here I've got some basic tests, which, per resource, I'm just doing your CRUD operations just to make sure that you're doing those well. And then I've got a suite of Connectathon tests that I keep updating as we go to each new Connectathon. And so these all collectively roll up into an overall conformance score as you're running these to represent how well you're doing. Okay. So notice I haven't run everything, right, because I've got some gray area in the Connectathon area. Well, why didn't I run these? I don't support them. My FHIR server doesn't support everything you see here. And so you go, well, is this really an accurate score from my server? Well, based on my capability statement, no. My capability statement says I support this, this, and some of this. So I really need to ignore this part. Even though somebody ran something against me for one of those tests, it doesn't apply to me. So I'm not surprised it failed. So a better way of doing this is if I hit this little checkbox to exclude unsupported. Now I'm going to bring the capability statement in to the filter. And whoops, I didn't take a screenshot, of course not. So what I'd like to do is actually show it to you. So let's get over to Touchstone. Let's see. No, don't have a quick link here, so let's go this way. So, not sure how I'm doing on time. Yeah, I think I'm okay. So this is Touchstone, the landing page. I'm just going to sign in as me. There we go. And let's go to Conformance. So you click on the little Analytics Conformance, and there you go. So I'm only at 1% right now. That's because I was playing around. And notice what I did here. What spec am I going against? DSTU2, right? Internally, that's FHIR 102 against my STU3 server. So I ran a patient suite of tests that only 50% passed. Well, I'm not surprised. I have a DSTU version of tests against my STU3 version of the server. So let me just flip this over to the correct FHIR spec version to get a better sense of how I'm doing here. There we go. So again, I've passed. So we do statistics collection per month. So at the end of the month, we'll reset your stats. That's just to encourage you to test a little bit more often and to keep your stat numbers up. So I'm up to Connectathon 16 here. And you can see I've got some tests that I haven't run yet. See how they're darker gray here? Okay, those are tests that my capability statement says I do support, but I haven't run them yet. Anything in the very, very light gray or white are things I don't support, and that's indicated by the fact that I've checked this off. If I uncheck it, then I'm just going to be compared against everything, and my number goes down a little bit, right? My overall number. But see, now it's expecting me to run everything because I'm not filtering by my capability statement. Does that make sense? So if I take a look at the stats I had last month, now I've run everything that I say I support, so if I exclude this, I'm at 100%. Yay. But you can take a look at other servers out there that might be publicly accessible. So if we were to look at, should I pick on Fiore?
Are you Did you just say that you are less conformant this month than last month?
No, I haven't run all the tests this month yet.
Oh.
So I'm encouraging myself to test more often, right? But I haven't completed all of the tests in the suites. So let's go to FHIR Client. I don't know if they've run anything yet. Oh, they've run it a little bit. Come on. Here we go. So they've run some of the advanced. So this is last month. Okay, so. But anyway, you know, so they've got a lot to run here yet, you know, to show. Thank you. But this is just to give you an idea. So if the server is publicly accessible, you can see their conformance results. Okay? Just be aware of that. So if you make your server publicly accessible, you're exposing your results. Okay? So how do you keep people from looking at your results? Well, you make your system private. If I were to go to my wildfire server, you can see that down here, it can be viewed by everyone and can be executed against by everyone. So if I were to come in here and say just my organization, then only the users in my organization would see that test system. So that's how you can limit access to your server, which is typically what you'll probably want to do when you first start out. If you have a public test server like Wildfire, then I just leave it open for everybody to play with. And if you find something wrong, please tell me, okay? But I'll probably see it pretty quick if you run it through Touchstone. Okay. Basically at that point, let me go back to the slides here. And I know this is going to flake out on you. Oh, no, it's good. Okay. Sorry.
Oh, wait.
Sorry, that was my Windows sounds. I'm using a theme there, a nautical theme. That was a seagull. There we go. All right. So with that, I have some hands-on exercises that go through some of the things that I've talked about here, where we're going to actually do that reliable, repeatable testing, where we have two users with the same data, and how do we resolve that from a testing perspective? So there's some techniques with our test scripts to ensure, and it revolves mostly around the data, right? So making sure that the data is unique per user for your test execution. And so we use variables and so forth to make that happen. I've got some tests here. So these are all test scripts that I've fielded in Touchstone for this class, where I've implemented comparisons of XPath versus JSONPath, rules and rule sets. The advanced test scripts are already out there available for you to play with. I've got some FHIR Client peer-to-peer testing and so forth. So if we take a look here in Touchstone, if I look at the FHIR definitions, this is where all the test scripts live. The thing now that I'm really excited about is we just released version 3.5 of Touchstone, and so now you have available to you what we call the FHIR Sandbox. This is where you can upload your own test scripts. So every organization has their own sandbox. And so you can take test scripts that even I've written and change them, modify them, and upload them and try this out. So for DevDays, I've done under our Aegis sandbox, the FHIR 301 DevDays, and I also have a Connectathon 17, where I'm looking at the subscriptions track and trying out some test scripts. So you can take a look at all the exercises are there under DevDays. So the test scripts that correlate to the exercises. And one thing that I noticed is that FHIR was supposed to print out hard copy all my exercise pages, but they didn't actually do that. They only printed out one or two of the actual exercises. So the exercises are available on GitHub, and I've made PDF versions of them all. So I've done the DevDays 17 exercises just in a repository. Yes?
Yeah, I have a specific question about
Yes.
an exercise. I want to do a test for an operation definition. Do you
Okay.
have an exercise for that?
I do not have an exercise, but that's a good, you should have talked to me earlier, and I probably could have worked one out. But yeah, that's a good one too, because
Trying to do.
yeah, because we support all of the operations in FHIR, even the extended operations framework. So as long as it's a operation defined within the FHIR spec as an extended operation, but if it's a new one,
Yes.
we would have to work with you to figure that out. okay, to incorporate that. But I'm sure we can work something out and figure that out. So if you go up here to my Ettema DevDays 17-exercises, you'll find all of the PDF versions of the exercises here for both yesterday's intro class and today's advanced class. So come over here, I'll just illustrate. So I've got a few more here. So reliable testing. Right, so you can look at, walk through everything here online and print them out at your leisure if you wish. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
So you're going both ways. You're doing the client side and the server side.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to use the same test script setup if you're testing both ways? I think I saw that.
Yeah. So in the setup, you have to choose which client, which server is going to be part of that test setup.
Yeah.
So you can create another test setup with a different client and a server. So you can create multiple test setups that have different actors. If that's what you're talking
So then you're varying the client, for instance?
You're varying the client. You can also vary the server as well, too.
But could you swap them around with the same test script that you want to test
Well,
exactly the other part?
one has to be the client, one has to be the server. So
yeah.
So you would have to create two test setups where you would do that for.
Okay. Well.
Right.
Yeah.
So one would have one as the client, the other one would have it as the server.
Yeah.
Right.
Got it.
Yeah. So we can do it. You'll just have to do a couple different test setup definitions.
My question is more maybe. I think I saw that the test script is in the scope of that test.
Mm-hmm.
You need to actually state that you're testing a client,
or
could it be more generic?
Yeah, there's a section where you define what your origins and your destinations are.
Yeah.
And it's a generic definition because at setup time, you will decide which client, which server correlates to that origin and destination in the definition. Okay. And we can talk about it at the desk too. So if you have other questions, come see me over at the FHIR testing table, which is right next to the bar, conveniently located, and we can talk more. Thank you.